Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about a couple of different topics. The first one is the problem with sampling. So looking at the way we do samples, looking at the way we do surveys, and determining what the problems are. You already did this, or if you haven't, do this. And then we're going to talk about what are the problems with these surveys. So here we go. We're going to identify what's wrong in each of these surveys. First of all, Mayor of Springfield is interested in finding out the average age of people in the city. He obtains a list of all the landline telephones in the city, and then he conducts a simple random sample of 300 people. He used the data from the sample to estimate the average age of people in the city. What's wrong with the survey? Well, as you can imagine, he picks this criteria of landline, right? You have to have a landline. So the first problem is he is, oops, let me get my pen here. He is only contacting people with a landline. And so people without phones aren't surveyed. So people without phones aren't surveyed, or if they have their cell phone as their primary, that's that's a problem. I don't have a landline, so I wouldn't even be asked. And so maybe you said something like only older people have landlines. That may be a little bit of speculation, but at the very least, you have to say he didn't ask a big population of the people. This is what's known as undercoverage. And we're going to talk about what that means in a few minutes. But undercoverage is when you miss a part of the population that's representative of who you're trying to get information about. Second thing, do you think the mayor will underestimate or overestimate the mean people in Springfield? Probably this is where you'd mention the fact that older people have landlines. So he'd probably overestimate. People with landlines are older, right? So these are things that can come up in surveys, and we talk about people who have cell phones and use cell phones as their primary source of phone. Older people, so you're going to tend to overestimate. Secondly, the administration at a school wants to know the proportion of students that did all of their homework last night. They select a simple random sample of 100 students and send them an email asking if they did all their homework last night. Of the 40 responses, 36 said they did all their homework last night, 90%. What's wrong with the survey? Well, first of all, only 40 of 100 responded. Okay, so only 40 of 100 responded. And what this is called is, this is called non-response. Non-response is when people who you ask don't respond. So you don't have them in a lab where you make sure they get it, they get the they take the survey or they answer the question. So non-response is when you don't have responses to what you asked. And so the other problem is that, imagine this comes from the school administration. So your principal emails you and says, hey, did you do your homework? People are probably going to lie. So students might, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Students might lie. And say they did their homework, even if they didn't. Okay, and so what that does is the way that we ask this question. So because it was the school administration asking, because it was an anonymous email, this is called, this is inducing response bias. Now here's the thing. when you're looking at response bias, you can't say that, oh, for sure people lied. But what you have to consider the fact is the way that you ask the question and the circumstances surrounding this survey could have induced response bias. And so you have to ask in such a way, you have to construct your survey in such a way so that you don't induce response bias. Okay. Do you think the administration will over or underestimate? Probably overestimate. And why is that? Well, if people would lie, they tend probably to say yes instead of no. Students will lie because it's admin asking. That means principal, right? And say they did homework when they did not. Okay, so you need to have that, provide that context. That's kind of an AP necessary. So you can't just say they would lie. Well, if they lied, what would they say? So you got to say they would lie and say they did when they did. That's why it produces the overestimation. Okay, next one. Boy Scout Peter M. wants to know the proportion of people in his neighborhood who support the Boy Scouts. He takes a random sample of 30 homes and visits them dressed in his uniform. I'm going to underline visits them dressed in his uniform. What's wrong with this survey? Well, he is influencing responses because he's there, he's in his uniform. And it's potentially a response bias when people would look at the person in front of them and say, yeah, I don't like you. Well, some people would do that. But largely that's response bias because people might look at him and go, oh, yeah, I do love the Boy Scouts, even though they may not. He's standing there, right? He's in his uniform. So he is influencing responses. And so you say people don't want to tell him they don't support the Boy Scouts because they know he is one. Okay, so obviously when he's standing there in his uniform and they know he's a Boy Scout, it's going to be harder for them. And so this, we want to label this. This again is response bias. Okay, do you think Peter will overestimate or underestimate? Probably over. Right, because people may say they support the Boy Scouts when they do not. Okay, so you have to have you have to have that context here to say they might say they support the Boy Scouts when they do not. That's causing the overestimate. Okay, so let's break this down right here. Surveys are an important way that we gather information, or an important way that we can gather information. But some of the things that we have to make sure that we're taking into account is the context around which we are asking, right? And when we get our responses back at the end, we have to ask the question: does it cover the population that we're trying to cover? Like, did I ask enough people? Did the people that I asked actually answer? And so we talked about a couple of these things, but we're just going to review. The first big idea is undercoverage. Right? This was the situation up here when we had, people who you don't ask a whole demographic, right? You ask a question and you feel like you have enough responses, but you don't ask a large section of the people. Um, so undercoverage in general is when some members of the population cannot or are less likely to be chosen. Okay, so in the context of what we talked about last time with Justin Timberlake and taking a simple random sample, even if it was stratified, each section was equally likely to be chosen. And so for this, that example of the landlines gave us a couple of really good examples because not only were we limited by the physical hardware that we had, right? So did you have a landline? Well, if you don't, then you can't be asked. And the question was about age. And so you should consider the entire population, and it should be a case where everyone is equally likely to be asked. But also, age was a limiting factor for that, right? Because in general, people that take or have landlines tend to be older. And so that's a consideration also that we need to take into account. Okay, next one, non-response. Okay, non-response. Non-response is when an individual selected, when an individual but chooses not to participate or, and this is sometimes more likely, isn't reached. Right? So you have bad contact information, you miss them, you never follow up with them, and so you can't say that they responded if they didn't, obviously. So if it's voluntary response and they don't respond, right? So you don't have their answer, or you say I'm going to contact this person, you reach out to them, you don't get it. Okay, so in this, it's different from voluntary response in this way. So I kind of mentioned voluntary response, but it's different in this way. Voluntary response, you're not necessarily, so you select the people that you're trying to contact for this. With voluntary response, you just put out a general, okay, everybody, here we go. With this one, you're saying, I've identified this person, but they didn't follow through on it. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, response bias is our last piece here. That's my star. Response bias. This is that case where you've got the Boy Scout who's standing there and, influencing your responses. This is the case where the way that you ask a question can be leading. This is the situation that the admin is asking you, did you do your homework, okay? And so response bias is a pattern of inaccurate responses. Factors could be the wording. It could be the interviewer. It could be lying, right? So people setting them up to feel like they have to lie, or anything like that that's going to influence your responses. Okay, so response bias is when there's a bias introduced into the question or the situation that causes inaccurate responses. Okay, So each of the following is a possible source of bias in a sample survey. Name the type of bias that could result. I want you to work on this, and you're gonna answer these questions, and I'm gonna look at those. We're gonna discuss them next time. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.